He gets up. He is walking. He is talking. Two of the fastest men in the world, Emerson Fittipaldi and Hans-Joachim Stuck, are the ones who reach him first, and by the time they get to him, he is already conscious, already making sense, already looking like a man who just had a hard scare rather than the beginning of the end of his life. Nobody at that racetrack in Austria on August the 17th, 1975, thinks they are watching a man die. He is helped into a car, taken to a nearby hospital, and by every outward appearance, he seems fine. 2 days later, he is gone, not from the crash itself, from a headache that would not go away. This is the story of Mark Donohue, a man so obsessively precise, so relentlessly engineered in everything he did behind the wheel, that people genuinely accused him of having an unfair advantage over drivers who raced on instinct alone. And in the end, the one thing his engineering mind could never calculate, the one variable he could not model or predict or prepare for, was a random piece of fencing and a slow bleed inside his own skull that nobody, including the doctors treating him, saw coming in time. Mark Neary Donohue Jr. was born on March the 18th, 1937, and grew up to become something genuinely rare in American motorsport, a driver who was just as comfortable with a slide rule as he was with a steering wheel. He attended Brown University, earning a real degree in mechanical engineering, at a time when most of the men he would eventually race against had learned everything they knew from grease under their fingernails and years of trial and error on dirt tracks. Donohue approached racing the way an engineer approaches a broken machine, not as an art form governed by feel and courage alone, but as a system that could be understood, measured, and optimized, piece by piece, until every advantage had been squeezed out of it. He earned the nickname Captain Nice for his polite, almost boyish demeanor away from the car. Inside the car, and inside the garage, some of his rivals gave him a very different name behind his back: Dark Monohue. Relentless, ruthless in that quiet, methodical way that made him nearly impossible to outprepare. His career truly began to take shape in 1966 when he met an ambitious young team owner named Roger Penske. The two men clicked almost instantly, not just as friends but as two obsessive minds who shared the exact same hunger, a phrase Donohue would later use as the title of his own autobiography. They called it the unfair advantage, the idea that in a sport where every competitor was technically following the same rulebook, the smartest, most detail-obsessed team could still find a genuine edge nobody else had thought to look for. Before that partnership fully took shape, Donohue had already been mentored by veteran sports car racer Walt Hansken, who saw something special in the young engineer and brought him in as a co-driver at Sebring and later at the Daytona 24 Hours. It is worth pausing on one small eerie detail here, because it will not be the last time this story circles back to it. Hansken himself was killed in 1966, testing a Ford GT40 at Le Mans, just months after giving Donohue his first real break in top-level sports car racing. Mark Donohue's entire career, from its very first breakthrough all the way to its final chapter, would end up bracketed by exactly the kind of tragedy that his own meticulous, engineering-driven mindset was always quietly trying to outthink. Together, Donohue and Penske became one of the most devastatingly effective partnerships in the history of American racing. They dominated the Trans Am Series. They dominated IROC. They tore through the Can-Am Series so thoroughly that Donohue's turbocharged Porsche 917-30, a car so powerful it earned the nickname the Batmobile, is still remembered as one of the most dominant race cars ever built for any series, anywhere. He even won on NASCAR's Riverside Road Course, an oval racer's world that had almost nothing in common with the road course technicality he specialized in. In 1972, after finishing runner-up 2 years earlier, he won the Indianapolis 500 outright. By any measure, Mark Donohue had already built one of the most complete, most versatile careers in the entire history of American motorsport, a resume that would eventually total somewhere around 119 career race victories across an almost absurd range of disciplines, and then in 1973, at the absolute height of his powers, having just won the Can-Am Championship, he decided to stop. Donohue stepped back from full-time driving to become president of Penske Racing, taking on responsibility for every single engineering and racing project the growing organization ran. It should have been the natural, comfortable next chapter for a man who had always been as much an engineer as a racer. Those close to him would later say it was not quite that simple. Donohue struggled quietly, with the identity of no longer being the one behind the wheel, wrestling with exactly what a racing driver becomes. Once he stops racing, the thing he had loved doing more than almost anything else in his life, he might have stayed in that uneasy, unresolved retirement indefinitely, had it not been for a tragedy that had nothing to do with him at all. In early 1974, Roger Penske was preparing to launch a full-scale Formula One program, and the driver he wanted for the job was a talented American named Peter Revson. Then, during practice for the 1974 South African Grand Prix, Revson was killed in a crash. Penske needed a new driver for his fledgling phone team, and there was only ever going to be one real answer. Mark Donohue came out of retirement, not out of restlessness or boredom, but because another driver's death had left an opening he felt almost obligated to fill. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the first quiet, unbearable piece of irony sitting underneath this entire story. Mark Donohue's return to a race car, the return that would ultimately cost him his own life, was set in motion by someone else's fatal accident. The comeback did not go smoothly. Penske's Formula One car, the P-Cone, was a competitive midfield effort at best, consistently a couple of seconds off the pace of the sport's frontrunners, and Donohue, a man who had spent his entire career finding the smallest possible margins other drivers overlooked, found himself racing on unfamiliar tracks against rivals who had spent years learning every inch of them. By his own admission, and by the accounts of people close to him, he was harder on himself about that gap than anyone else around him ever was. This was not a driver coasting on reputation. This was a perfectionist watching his own tools fail to deliver the result his mind told him they should, and yet, even in the middle of that frustrating phone campaign, Mark Donohue proved he had lost absolutely none of his edge. Just 2 weeks before Austria, he climbed into that same turbocharged Porsche Can-Am car, the Batmobile, at Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama, and set a closed-course world speed record, averaging more than 221 miles an hour over a lap of one of the fastest tracks on Earth. It was a record that would stand for years. Whatever doubts Donohue carried about his form in Formula One, there was clearly nothing at all wrong with his nerve, his precision, or his sheer physical courage behind the wheel of a race car. He arrived in Austria for the Grand Prix weekend, fresh off one of the single greatest performances of his entire career. Keep that image in your mind for a moment. A driver at the absolute physical peak of his abilities, having just set a record that would outlast him by decades, because it makes what happens next feel even more senseless. On the morning of Sunday, August the 17th, 1975, during the warm-up session ahead of the Austrian Grand Prix at the Osterreichring, Donohue was on just his second lap, approaching a flat-out right-hand corner called West-Hügel at nearly 160 miles an hour, when the left front tire on his March 751 suddenly lost pressure and failed. At that speed, on that section of track, there was almost nothing he could have done differently. No engineering solution, no perfectly calculated line that changes what happens next. The car speared off the circuit and tore through 60 meters of catch fencing and roadside advertising billboards, climbed up and over a guardrail, and finally came to rest overturned in a ravine, close to an underpass where a group of people happened to be standing. Debris from the disintegrating car, including an entire wheel, was thrown into that crowd. A track marshal named Manfred Schaller was killed. 2 others, a fellow marshal and a police officer, were seriously injured. Donohue himself had been struck in the head, either by a fence post or by part of the wooden frame supporting one of the trackside advertising boards, and was knocked unconscious in the wreckage. This is where the story takes the turn that makes it so quietly devastating. So stay with me, because this next part is the entire reason this crash is still discussed more than 50 years later. Fellow drivers Emerson Fittipaldi, Bob Evans, and Hans-Joachim Stuck were among the very first people to reach the crash site, and within minutes, Donohue regained consciousness and began speaking with them, coherent, aware, seemingly steady. He was taken to a hospital in nearby Knittelfeld, complaining mainly of a headache, the kind of ordinary, forgettable complaint that follows an ordinary hard knock to the head. Nobody treating him in those first hours believed they were looking at a life-threatening injury. by every outward sign available to the people around him that morning. Mark Donohue had walked away from a horrific, fence-shredding, billboard-destroying accident relatively unscathed. Exactly the kind of story that usually ends with a few stitches and a driver back in the paddock joking about it within a week. But the headache did not go away. As the day wore on, his condition began to quietly, steadily worsen, and doctors made the decision to airlift him to a university medical clinic in Graz, where surgeons operated on him directly. It was too late. What Donohue was actually suffering from was a slow, spreading brain hemorrhage, a bleed that had begun with that initial impact and continued building pressure inside his skull long after he had already been up, talking, and seemingly fine. 2 days after the crash, on August the 19th, 1975, Mark Donohue died. At his bedside were his father, his second wife Eden, married to him for only 8 months, and Roger Penske, the friend and partner who had built an entire era of American motorsport dominance alongside him. The racing world's reaction to his death carried a specific kind of disbelief that goes beyond ordinary grief. This was not a driver who died instantly in a violent, unsurvivable impact, the kind of tragedy the sport had unfortunately grown almost accustomed to processing. This was a driver who, by every account of the people who reached him first, seemed to have survived. He spoke, he recognized his rescuers. He complained about something as mundane as a headache, and then, quietly, invisibly, something inside his skull kept bleeding until it was too late to stop. And here is the detail that makes it even harder to sit with. Doctors today would almost certainly recognize the warning signs of what medicine now calls a lucid interval, a deceptively normal, alert period that can follow a serious head injury before a slow bleed finally overwhelms the brain, and would move immediately to imaging and monitoring. Most hospitals simply did not have readily available in rural Austria in 1975. Donohue was not failed by careless doctors. He was failed by an era of medicine that had not yet caught up to the exact kind of injury his engineering mind never got the chance to study. For a man who had spent his entire career trying to eliminate every possible variable, who had literally written a book about finding hidden advantages other competitors overlooked, there was something almost unbearably cruel about being killed by the one kind of injury that gives absolutely no early warning a layperson, or even most doctors of that era, could reliably catch in time. Roger Penske never fully recovered his enthusiasm for Formula One after that season. The team withdrew from the sport entirely at the end of 1975, redirecting its energy back toward the American racing programs Donohue had helped build in the first place. A year later, in 1976, driver John Watson won the Austrian Grand Prix for Team Penske at that exact same circuit, delivering the organization's only Formula One victory in its short history, a bittersweet, almost haunting tribute that arrived exactly 1 year after the track had taken Penske's closest friend and his sport's most complete driver. In the aftermath of the crash, officials tightened the corner where Donohue lost control, physically altering the layout of the circuit. A quiet, permanent acknowledgement that the section of track that killed him was simply too fast, too exposed, and too close to the crowd to remain unchanged. So why does Mark Donohue's story deserve to be told with this much detail, exactly 51 years after that Austrian morning? Because his death sits at the exact, uncomfortable intersection of everything that made him remarkable in the first place. He was a man who genuinely believed, and largely proved through more than 100 career wins across nearly every major discipline in American motorsport, that intelligence, preparation, and relentless engineering could outthink risk itself. He came out of retirement because another driver's death demanded someone fill the gap. He set a world speed record just 2 weeks before his own fatal crash, proof that his skill had never faded even as his phone season frustrated him. And then he survived the actual impact of the accident that killed him, walked, talked, and seemed fine, only to lose his life 2 days later to something no amount of engineering brilliance could have detected in time. Mark Donohue spent his entire career finding the unfair advantage other people missed. In the end, it was an advantage nobody could find, not the doctors, not his rescuers, and not even the most analytical mind in American racing, sitting quietly inside his own skull while everyone around him, including Mark Donohue himself, believed he had already survived the worst of it. If this story affected you the way it affected me while researching it, do us a favor and hit subscribe, because every week on this channel we dig into another one of these stories, the crashes, the comebacks, and the quiet, invisible moments that shaped motorsport history far more than the headlines from that day ever let on. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.